Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the polished and picture-perfect world of 1950s America, a time often remembered as an era of happy families, shining kitchens and smiling housewives. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, grab something comfortable, and settle in as we explore the strange etiquette rules that millions of women were expected to follow every single day. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not because you wanted to, but because an invisible set of social expectations demanded it. Long before many husbands returned home from work, countless women were already busy cleaning floors, washing dishes, ironing clothes, preparing meals, and making sure every corner of the house looked spotless. In magazines, advertisements, and television programs, the ideal housewife was presented almost like a living decoration. She was expected to look beautiful, remain cheerful, and keep the home running perfectly no matter how tired she felt. One of the strangest expectations involved greeting a husband when he returned from work. Advice columns encouraged women to prepare themselves before he arrived. They were told to touch up their appearance, put on a fresh dress, fix their hair, and make sure the house looked calm and welcoming. Children were often expected to stay quiet. Loud noises were discouraged. So girl was to create a peaceful environment where the husband could relax after a long day. Whether the wife herself had been working non-stop for hours was rarely considered important. Some guides even suggested that wives should listen carefully to their husbands without interrupting. If a husband wanted to talk about his day, she was expected to pay full attention. If she had problems of her own, many social rules implied that those concerns could wait. Today, this may sound unfair, but at the time, such advice appeared in popular publications across the country. The pressure extended beyond behaviour. Appearance was considered extremely important. A woman could be judged by neighbours, relatives, and even strangers, based on how clean her home looked or how well she presented herself in public. A perfectly arranged living room became a symbol of respectability. A wrinkle in a dress or a dusty shelf could sometimes feel like a public failure. Behind the smiling photographs and colourful advertisements, many women experienced constant pressure to live up to standards that were nearly impossible to maintain. And as we continue tonight's journey, you'll discover that these expectations were only the beginning of a much larger and stranger set of rules that shaped everyday life in 1950 Sekunde America. The expectations did not stop at cleaning and appearance. During the 1950s, many women were taught that being a successful wife meant placing the needs of everyone else before their own. Advice books often encouraged women to organise every detail of family life, from meal planning to household budgets, while making the work appear effortless. If guests arrived unexpectedly, the house was supposed to be ready. Fresh coffee, clean furniture, and a welcoming smile were considered signs of a well-managed home. The pressure to maintain this image followed women almost everywhere. Neighbourhoods became quiet stages where families were constantly observing one another. A neatly cut lawn, polished windows, and well-behaved children reflected not only on the husband but also on the wife. Some women spent hours each week ensuring their homes met these expectations. The fear of gossip was powerful. A neighbour's criticism could damage a family's reputation more than many people today might imagine. Social gatherings introduced another layer of etiquette. Dinner parties required careful planning. The hostess was expected to prepare food, arrange decorations, and make every guest feel comfortable. If something went wrong, responsibility usually fell on her shoulders. Even seating arrangements and serving order could be viewed as important details. A successful gathering was seen as proof that a woman possessed good manners and proper character. Advertising companies eagerly reinforced these standards. Magazine pages showed smiling women proudly displaying new appliances, sparkling kitchens, and perfectly prepared meals. These images suggested that happiness could be achieved through flawless housekeeping. Yet real life was rarely so simple. Many women felt exhausted trying to match the idealized version presented in advertisements. The gap between reality and expectation often created feelings of frustration and disappointment. Financial dependence also shaped daily life. In many households, the husband controlled most major financial decisions. Women frequently managed grocery budgets and household expenses, but larger purchases often remained outside their authority. This arrangement was considered normal by much of society. Few people openly questioned it. As a result, countless women found themselves responsible for running an entire household, while having limited control over important decisions affecting their future. Education and career ambitions were often pushed aside as well. Although many women possessed talents and interests beyond domestic life, society frequently encouraged them to focus primarily on marriage and family. Success was measured less by personal achievements and more by the ability to create a comfortable home. For some women, this role brought satisfaction, but for others it felt restrictive. Beneath the cheerful image of suburban life, a growing number began quietly wondering whether there could be more opportunities available to them than the narrow path society expected them to follow. As the decade continued, the rules surrounding motherhood became just as demanding as those connected to marriage. Mothers were expected to raise polite, obedient children who reflected positively on the family. If a child misbehaved in public, many people believed it revealed a failure in the mother's character rather than a normal part of childhood. Parenting books offered endless instructions about proper behaviour, feeding schedules, and discipline methods. Women often felt they were being judged constantly, whether by relatives, neighbours, teachers, or even strangers at the grocery store. Fashion carried its own set of expectations. Leaving the house without looking presentable was often considered inappropriate. Women frequently wore dresses, styled their hair carefully, and paid close attention to their appearance even during ordinary errands. The idea of relaxing in public without concern for appearance was far less accepted than it is today. Looking respectable was viewed as a responsibility rather than a personal choice. Another unusual expectation involved emotional control. Housewives were encouraged to remain calm, pleasant, and supportive regardless of circumstances. Feelings such as anger, frustration, or disappointment were rarely discussed openly. If a woman felt overwhelmed by endless responsibilities, she was often expected to handle those emotions privately. Mental health struggles received far less understanding than they do today, leaving many women to face challenges in silence. Television helped spread these ideals into millions of homes. Popular programs often portrayed families where problems were solved quickly and everyone appeared content. These fictional households reinforced the belief that a successful woman should effortlessly balance housekeeping, child rearing, social obligations, and personal appearance. Real families naturally experience difficulties, but television rarely showed the exhausting reality behind the scenes. Yet beneath the surface, change was slowly beginning. Some women started questioning why so many opportunities seemed unavailable to them. Others wondered why their contributions were often taken for granted, despite the enormous amount of work required to manage a household. Conversations that had once remained private gradually became more common. Though the changes were still small, they marked the beginning of a shift that would grow much larger in the years ahead. The image of the perfect 1950s housewife remained powerful, but cracks were beginning to appear beneath the glossy surface, revealing a more complicated reality than the advertisements and television shows had ever been willing to admit. By the late 1950s, many women found themselves living between two very different realities. On one side was the dream presented in advertisements: a beautiful home, modern appliances, smiling children, and a successful husband. On the other side was the daily routine of endless chores that never truly ended. New appliances such as washing machines and vacuum cleaners were advertised as tools that would make life easier. In reality, these inventions often raised expectations instead of reducing work. Because cleaning became faster, society expected homes to be cleaner than ever before. Standards continued to rise, and many women simply found themselves working differently rather than working less. The social pressure to keep up with neighbours could be intense. Families compared furniture, cars, clothing, and even holiday decorations. A woman whose home appeared less organised could feel embarrassed or excluded from social circles. Suburban neighbourhoods often looked peaceful from the outside, but many residents privately worried about meeting the expectations of those around them. Maintaining appearances became almost a full-time responsibility. Hospitality rules added even more demands. If visitors stopped by, refreshments were expected. If relatives visited, the home needed to look welcoming. Women often spent significant amounts of time preparing for events that lasted only a few hours. A successful hostess was expected to make everything appear effortless, even when she had spent days planning every detail. The less effort guests noticed, the more successful she was considered. For women who wanted careers, opportunities could be limited. Some worked as teachers, nurses, secretaries, or in other professions, but many faced pressure to leave those jobs after marriage. Society frequently portrayed a woman's greatest achievement as becoming a wife and mother. Those who desired something different were sometimes viewed as unusual or selfish. While not everyone shared these beliefs, they remained powerful influences throughout much of the decade. Despite these restrictions, many women quietly developed strong communities with one another. They exchanged advice, shared frustrations, and supported friends facing similar challenges. Behind closed doors, honest conversations often sounded very different from the cheerful public image presented to the world. These friendships helped many women cope with the demands of everyday life. As the decade moved toward the 1960s, the old rules that had once seemed permanent were beginning to face increasing questions. Younger generations were growing up in a changing world. New ideas about education, independence, and personal freedom were slowly spreading. The image of the perfect housewife still dominated magazines and television screens, but more and more people were starting to wonder whether happiness could be defined by something larger than a spotless kitchen and a perfectly arranged living room. What makes this period particularly fascinating is that many of these expectations were so common that people rarely stopped to question them. A young woman growing up in the 1950s was surrounded by messages telling her what a successful future should look like. School courses often included lessons on homemaking. Magazines featured articles about cooking, cleaning, childcare, and pleasing one's husband. Television programs reinforced similar ideas night after night. The message was repeated so often that it seemed completely natural to millions of people. Yet reality was far more complicated. Not every family matched the ideal image shown in advertisements. Some households struggled financially. Others faced illness, loss, or personal difficulties that could not be solved with a smile and a tidy living room. Many women carried enormous responsibilities while receiving little recognition for the effort required to keep a household functioning. Their work was essential, but because it happened inside the home, it was often overlooked. The pressure to appear happy could be especially difficult. Publicly discussing loneliness or dissatisfaction was often discouraged. "Oh, woman WHO," admitted she felt overwhelmed, risked being seen as ungrateful or unsuccessful. As a result, countless individuals kept their concerns private. They continued performing their daily routines, while hiding worries that few people around them fully understood. Looking back, historians now recognise that the cheerful image of the decade sometimes concealed struggles that remained invisible to the outside world. Consumer culture also played a major role. Companies constantly introduced new products promising to create the perfect home. Families were encouraged to purchase the latest appliances, furniture, and decorations. Advertising suggested that happiness was connected to owning the right things. For many households, keeping up with these expectations created financial pressure of its own. The dream of perfection could be expensive. At the same time, society itself was beginning to change. More women were pursuing higher education. New ideas about independence and equality were slowly gaining attention. Books, newspapers, and public discussions started raising questions that previous generations rarely asked. Why should certain opportunities be reserved primarily for men? Why were women expected to sacrifice so many personal ambitions? These conversations remained relatively quiet at first, but they were growing stronger with each passing year. By the end of the decade, the world that had seemed so stable was already beginning to shift. The rules that once appeared unchangeable would soon face challenges from a new generation determined to redefine what women could achieve. The perfect image of the 1950s housewife still existed, but beneath the surface, the foundations of that ideal were slowly starting to crack. As the early 1960s approached, many of the assumptions that had defined the previous decade were beginning to face a new reality. Young women who had grown up, watching their mothers devote nearly every hour to housework, were starting to imagine different possibilities for themselves. Colleges were welcoming more female students, and although many barriers remained, education was opening doors that earlier generations often never had the chance to enter. The idea that a woman's entire identity should revolve around the home was no longer accepted quite as unquestioningly as before. Still, change did not happen overnight. Millions of women continued following the routines that society expected from them. Every morning began with laundry, cleaning, cooking, shopping, and caring for children. The work was physically demanding and often repetitive. Unlike many jobs outside the home, there were no weekends, no paid vacations, and no official recognition for success. A meal prepared today would need to be prepared again tomorrow. A floor cleaned in the morning might be dirty again by evening. The responsibilities never truly ended. Many women became remarkably skilled managers without receiving that title. They balanced household budgets, organised schedules, planned meals, monitored expenses, cared for children, and solved daily problems. In modern terms, they were performing tasks that required organisation, leadership, and financial planning. Yet society often described these efforts as simply being a good housewife rather than recognising them as valuable skills. Looking back, one of the most surprising aspects of the era is how powerful social expectations could be. Rules were rarely enforced by law. Instead, they were maintained through culture, tradition, advertising, and community pressure. People followed them because they believed that was what respectable families were supposed to do. When everyone around you shares the same assumptions, questioning them can feel incredibly difficult. Today, many of the etiquette rules from the 1950s seem outdated or even strange. Yet understanding them helps us better understand the world that millions of people lived in. The decade was not simply a time of perfect families and spotless homes. It was also a period filled with expectations, pressures, sacrifices, and quiet frustrations that often remained hidden behind carefully practiced smiles. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from this story. History is rarely as simple as the photographs suggest. Behind every cheerful advertisement and every picture-perfect kitchen stood real people with hopes, worries, ambitions, and challenges of their own. The image of the ideal 1950s housewife became one of the most recognizable symbols of the era, but the reality of her life was far more complex than the world was willing to admit. The legacy of these expectations did not disappear when the 1950s ended. In many ways, the conversations that began during that period continued to shape society for decades afterward. Historians often look back at the era as a turning point, a moment when traditional ideas about family life reached one of their strongest forms, just before major social changes began to emerge. The image of the cheerful housewife standing in a spotless kitchen became one of the most recognizable symbols of 20th century America. Interestingly, many women held mixed feelings about the lifestyle they lived. Some genuinely enjoyed creating a comfortable home and took pride in caring for their families. Others felt trapped by expectations that left little room for personal goals outside the household. Most experienced a combination of both. Human lives are rarely simple, and the women of the 1950s were no different. Their experiences varied depending on income, location, education, family circumstances, and personal ambitions. When modern audiences look at photographs from the decade, they often notice the elegance of the clothing, the tidy neighbourhoods, and the sense of stability. What photographs cannot easily show are the countless hours of work required to maintain that appearance. A sparkling kitchen did not clean itself. Perfectly pressed clothes required time and effort. Family dinners, polished living rooms, and organised schedules were usually the result of many hours of invisible labour performed behind the scenes. Another misconception is that everyone lived according to the same ideal. In reality, millions of Americans lived very different lives. Rural families, working-class households, immigrants, and minority communities often faced challenges that looked quite different from the suburban dream commonly shown in advertisements. The popular image represented an aspiration rather than a universal reality. Even during its own time, many families could not fully achieve the standard that society promoted. As cultural changes accelerated during the following decades, people began re-evaluating many assumptions that had once seemed obvious. Opportunities expanded, expectations shifted, and new definitions of success emerged. The role of women in society evolved dramatically, opening paths that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Yet understanding where those changes came from requires understanding the world that existed before them. The story of the 1950s housewife is therefore more than a story about cooking meals or cleaning homes. It is a story about expectations, identity, and the powerful influence of culture on everyday life. It reminds us that what one generation considers normal may appear surprising to the next. The rules that shaped daily life for millions of women once felt as permanent as the walls of their homes. Yet history would eventually prove that even the strongest social expectations can change with time. Perhaps the most revealing part of this history is how ordinary these expectations seem to the people living through them. Many women never woke up believing they were participating in a social system that future generations would study and debate. They were simply doing what their mothers had done, what their neighbours were doing, and what society encouraged them to do. The routines of daily life felt normal because they were repeated day after day. year after year. Yet when historians examine the period today, they see a fascinating example of how culture can shape nearly every aspect of human. BEHAVIORA typical day often began early and ended late. Breakfast had to be prepared. Children needed attention. Shopping lists had to be organised. And household chores waited to be completed. Even after dinner was finished and dishes were washed, there were often clothes to mend, schedules to plan, and preparations to make for the following day. The amount of labour required to maintain a household was enormous, especially in larger families. Despite this, much of the work remained unnoticed because it happened behind closed doors. Many women became experts at solving problems with limited resources. They learned how to stretch household budgets, repair damaged items, and create meals from whatever ingredients were available. During difficult financial periods, these skills could make a significant difference in a family's quality of life. Although their contributions were often overlooked by the broader society, they played a crucial role in maintaining stability within their homes. The expectations placed upon women also influenced how they viewed themselves. Success was frequently measured through the happiness of others. If children behaved well, if guests complimented the house, or if a husband appeared satisfied, a woman was often considered successful. Personal ambitions, creative interests, and individual goals sometimes received less attention. While some women found fulfillment in this arrangement, others quietly wondered what their lives might have looked like under different circumstances. As years passed, these questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. New opportunities, changing attitudes, and broader social movements encouraged people to rethink long-standing traditions. Ideas that had once been accepted, without question, were now being examined more carefully. The world was changing, and with it came new conversations about freedom, opportunity, and personal choice. Looking back from the present day, it is easy to focus on the unusual rules and expectations of the 1950s, yet the real story is ultimately about people adapting to the world around them. The women of that era lived within a set of cultural expectations that shaped their decisions, their routines, and their futures. Their experiences became part of a much larger historical journey, one that would eventually transform society in ways few people at the time could have predicted. The more we examine this era, the clearer it becomes that the 1950s were filled with contradictions. On the surface, many communities appeared stable, prosperous, and optimistic. Families purchased new homes, televisions became common, and consumer goods flooded the market. To many Americans, it felt like the future had finally arrived. Yet beneath that optimism existed a set of expectations that demanded constant effort from the people responsible for maintaining the image of the perfect family. For countless women, much of life revolved around responsibility. Birthdays had to be organised, meals had to be planned, appointments remembered, and household supplies kept stocked. These tasks may seem small when viewed individually, but together they formed an endless chain of obligations. Modern historians sometimes describe this as invisible labour because much of the effort was difficult for others to notice. when everything went smoothly. Few people thought about the work required to make it happen. Children who grew up during this period often remembered their mothers as being constantly busy. There was always another task waiting to be completed. A shirt needed ironing. A floor needed sweeping. Groceries needed purchasing. Dinner needed preparation. In many households, rest came only after every responsibility had been addressed. Even then, there was usually something left to do for the following day. The expectations of perfection could also create a sense of isolation. If a woman struggled, she might assume everyone else was handling life better than she was. After all, advertisements, magazines, and television programs rarely showed exhaustion or frustration. They showed smiling faces and spotless homes. As a result, many women compared their complicated reality to an unrealistic ideal. It was a comparison almost impossible to win. Yet despite the challenges, the women of the 1950s displayed remarkable resilience. They adapted to changing circumstances, supported their families through economic uncertainty, and managed responsibilities that would overwhelm many people. Their contributions helped shape entire communities, schools, neighborhoods, churches, and local organizations, often depended on the unpaid efforts of women working quietly, behind the scenes. Today, when we look back at old photographs from the decade, we see more than neatly dressed families and carefully maintained homes. We see individuals navigating a complex social world filled with expectations that seemed normal at the time. Their stories remind us that every historical period contains realities that are far more complicated than the images left behind. What appears simple from a distance often becomes much more interesting when examined closely, revealing the everyday experiences that defined life for millions of ordinary people across America. As the years passed and historians began studying the decade more closely, they discovered that the story of the 1950s housewife was far more complex than many people had assumed. Popular culture had preserved an image of endless happiness, but personal letters, interviews, and memoirs revealed a wider range of experiences. Some women remembered the decade fondly, describing strong communities, close family relationships, and a sense of purpose in caring for their households. Others recalled feelings of limitation, pressure, and the constant expectation to place their own desires second. One reason the era remains so fascinating is because it demonstrates how quickly social norms can change. Many of the rules that seemed completely ordinary during the 1950 Sekunde would appear unusual to later generations. Expectations about marriage, careers, education, and household responsibilities gradually evolved as society changed. What had once been viewed as common sense slowly became a topic of debate. New opportunities emerged, and people began imagining different ways to organize family life. The transformation did not happen all at once. Cultural change is often slow, taking years or even decades to unfold. Families continued passing traditions from one generation to the next, while younger people introduced new ideas of their own. Throughout this process, women remained at the centre of many discussions about the future of society. Questions about equality, opportunity, and personal freedom became increasingly important as the 20th century progressed. Looking back, it is important to remember that historical periods are rarely defined by a single experience. Not every woman lived the same life. Some enjoyed the role society expected them to play, while others hoped for greater independence. Some found satisfaction in homemaking, while others dreamed of careers, travel, education, or different opportunities. The diversity of those experiences is what makes history so interesting. Behind every statistic and every photograph stood a real person with unique hopes and challenges. The image of the 1950s housewife endures because it represents more than a specific decade. It serves as a reminder of how cultural expectations influence everyday life. The choices people make are often shaped by the world around them, by the values they are taught, and by the opportunities available to them. Understanding those influences helps us better understand not only the past but also the present. And as our journey through this remarkable period continues, we begin to see that the spotless kitchens, cheerful advertisements, and carefully arranged living rooms were only part of the story. Behind the polished image existed a generation of women whose daily efforts kept families and communities functioning, even when their contributions were not always fully recognized. Their experiences remain an essential chapter in the history of modern America. By the time later generations began looking back on the 1950s, many people were surprised by how much daily life had changed. Tasks at once required hours of effort could now be completed in a fraction of the time. Attitudes toward education, careers, and family responsibilities had evolved dramatically. Yet despite these changes, the experiences of women from that era continued to influence future generations in important ways. Their successes, struggles, and sacrifices became part of a larger story about how societies adapt over time. Many daughters who grew up watching their mothers manage households carried valuable lessons into adulthood. They learned organization, responsibility, and perseverance. At the same time, some also noticed the limitations their mothers faced and hoped for broader opportunities. This combination of admiration and reflection helped shape the changing attitudes that emerged during the following decades. Progress often grows from people respecting the past while imagining a different future. It is also worth remembering that housewives were not simply passive observers of history. They participated in community events, volunteered in schools, organized local activities, supported charitable causes, and helped build the neighborhoods where millions of families lived. Much of this work rarely appeared in history books, yet it contributed significantly to everyday life across the country. Entire communities depended on the efforts of women whose names were never widely known. The stereotype of the perfect housewife can sometimes make it easy to forget how much individuality existed beneath the surface. Some women loved gardening. Others enjoyed writing, painting, reading, or learning new skills. Many had ambitions and talents that extended far beyond household responsibilities. Even when society encouraged conformity, people remained unique individuals with their own personalities. dreams, and interests. Their private lives were often far richer than the simple images shown in advertisements. As historians continue studying the period, they increasingly focus on these personal stories. Diaries, interviews, and family records reveal experiences that advertisements never captured. They show moments of joy, frustration, hope, and resilience. They remind us that history is not only about major events and famous figures, but also about ordinary people navigating the challenges of everyday life. Perhaps that is why the story of the 1950s housewife remains so compelling today. It offers a glimpse into a world that feels both familiar and distant. The homes, clothing, and customs may belong to another era, but the human experiences at the centre of the story are timeless. People still seek happiness, security, purpose, and connection with those they love. The circumstances may change, but those desires remain remarkably consistent across generations. And as we continue exploring this chapter of history, we begin to understand that behind every perfectly arranged family photograph was a much more complicated reality, one filled with hard work, personal sacrifices, quiet achievements, and stories that deserve to be remembered. Even today, the image of the 1950s housewife continues to appear in movies, television shows, and advertisements. People often remember the bright kitchens, colourful dresses, and carefully maintained suburban homes. Yet these images capture only a small part of what daily life was actually like. The reality involved countless hours of effort that were rarely celebrated. Every clean room, prepared meal, and organised family event represented work that often went unnoticed by the outside world. As time who had lived through the decade shared their memories with children and grandchildren. Some spoke proudly about the homes they created and the families they helped raise. Others described the pressure they felt to meet, standards that seemed impossible to achieve. Their stories remind us that history is never completely positive or completely negative. Most experiences contain elements of both. One of the most valuable lessons from this period is the importance of recognizing work that is often invisible. Household responsibilities may not always receive public attention, but they play a vital role in the lives of families and communities. The women of the 1950s spent enormous amounts of time performing tasks that allowed others to focus on school, careers, and other opportunities, whether society fully appreciated those efforts or not. Their contributions had a lasting impact. The decade also teaches us how strongly cultural expectations can influence behaviour. When a particular lifestyle is presented as the ideal, many people naturally feel pressure to follow it. This was true in the 1950s, and in many ways it remains true today. The standards may have changed, but every generation faces expectations about success, appearance, and personal achievement. Looking at the past helps us better understand these pressures in our own lives. As historians continue uncovering personal stories from the era, the picture becomes increasingly detailed. The 1950s were not simply a time of perfect families and endless smiles. They were a period filled with real people making difficult choices, adapting to social expectations, and trying to build meaningful lives for themselves and those they loved. Their experiences remain a fascinating reminder that behind every historical stereotype lies a far more human and complicated story, waiting to be discovered. Perhaps the reason this chapter of history continues to capture attention is because it reveals how quickly society can change many of the rules that shaped daily life in the 1950s seemed completely normal at the time. Few people imagined that future generations would look back and find some of those expectations surprising. Yet history is filled with examples of customs that once appeared permanent, but later faded away as new ideas emerged. The women who lived through this era experienced a world very different from the one we know today. Communication was slower, opportunities were often more limited, and social expectations carried tremendous weight. Reputation mattered deeply. Families worked hard to present themselves as respectable members of their communities, and much of that responsibility often fell on the shoulders of women. Whether preparing meals, caring for children, hosting guests, or maintaining a household, they played a central role in shaping everyday life. At the same time, these women witnessed the beginning of important changes. New technologies, expanding educational opportunities, and shifting cultural attitudes gradually transformed the possibilities available to future generations. The world their daughters inherited would look very different from the one they themselves had entered as young adults. In many ways, they stood at the crossroads between older traditions and a rapidly changing modern society. Their stories deserve to be remembered not because they were perfect, but because they were real. They faced challenges, adapted to expectations, solved problems, and built lives within the circumstances of their time. Some embraced the role society offered them, while others quietly hoped for something more. Together, their experiences created a rich and complicated picture of an era that is often remembered in overly simple terms. When we look beyond the polished advertisements and idealized television families, we discover people who were navigating the same basic questions that humans have always faced. How do we create a good life? How do we balance responsibility with personal happiness? How do we meet society's expectations while remaining true to ourselves? These questions were just as important in the 1950s as they are today. And as our exploration of the 1950s housewife slowly continues, we begin to understand that history is not merely a collection of dates and events. It is the story of ordinary people living ordinary lives, making choices, overcoming challenges, and shaping the world that future generations would inherit. Their experiences remain a powerful reminder that even the most familiar images from the past often hide stories far deeper than they first appear. As we move further away from the 1950s, it becomes easier to see the decade as part of a much larger historical story. No generation exists in isolation. The values, traditions, and expectations of one era often influence the next. The women who managed homes, raised families, and carried countless daily responsibilities helped create the foundation upon which future generations would build. Their efforts shaped communities, neighbourhoods, and family traditions that continued long after the decade itself had ended. One interesting aspect of this period is how strongly people believed in the idea of normality. There was often a clear picture of what a successful life was supposed to look like. A stable marriage, a comfortable home, respectful children, and a carefully maintained household were viewed as important goals. Those who followed this path were often praised, while those who chose different directions sometimes faced criticism or misunderstanding. The desire to fit in could be incredibly powerful. Yet, even during the height of these expectations, individuals found ways to express their own personalities. Some women became passionate gardeners, talented cooks, community leaders, or dedicated volunteers. Others spent their free time reading, writing, creating art, or pursuing hobbies that brought them joy. While society promoted a specific image of womanhood, real people remained far more diverse than any stereotype could capture. Looking back, it is clear that the story of the 1950s housewife is not simply about restrictions or expectations. It is also a story about resilience. Day after day, women solved problems, cared for loved ones, managed limited resources, and kept households running through both good times and difficult ones. Many performed these tasks without expecting recognition. Their achievements were often measured not in awards or public attention, but in the stability and support they provided to those around them. History sometimes focuses on presidents, wars, inventions, and famous events. Yet the lives of ordinary people are just as important for understanding the past. The routines carried out in kitchens, living rooms, schools, and neighbourhoods reveal how society actually functioned. They show us how people experienced history on a personal level rather than simply reading about it in textbooks. The more closely we examine the lives of 1950s housewives, the more we discover a world that was both familiar and remarkably different from our own. It was a world shaped by tradition, expectation, and rapid social change, and hidden beneath the polished surface of perfect advertisements and smiling family photographs were countless personal stories that continue to help us understand what life was truly like during one of America's most iconic decades. Another reason the 1950s continue to fascinate historians is that they represented a period of enormous confidence after years of economic hardship and global conflict. Many families hoped they had finally found stability. New homes appeared across expanding suburbs, businesses grew, and consumer products promised a more comfortable future. To many Americans, it seemed as though prosperity would continue indefinitely. The housewife stood at the centre of this vision, presented as the person responsible for transforming a house into a happy home. But maintaining that vision required constant effort. The expectations placed on women were not limited to physical work alone. They were also expected to serve as emotional anchors for their families. If children were upset, if relatives needed support, or if household problems arose, women were often expected to handle the situation calmly and efficiently. This emotional labour rarely appeared in advertisements, yet it formed a significant part of everyday life. Many women became experts at creating a sense of comfort, even during difficult circumstances. Financial worries, health concerns, and personal struggles still existed despite the cheerful public image of the decade. Families experienced challenges just as families do today. The difference was that people were often encouraged to keep those difficulties private. Maintaining an appearance of success was considered important, even when reality was far more complicated. The passage of time has allowed historians to see beyond the stereotypes. Rather than viewing 1950s housewives as a single group with identical experiences, researchers now recognize the diversity of their lives. Women from different regions, backgrounds, and economic situations often faced very different realities. Some lived in growing suburban neighborhoods, while others remained in rural communities or crowded cities. Their daily routines varied, but many shared the common experience of navigating powerful social expectations. What makes these stories so valuable is their ability to reveal the human side of history. Large historical trends become easier to understand when viewed through the experiences of ordinary individuals. The decisions made in millions of kitchens and living rooms helped shape the culture of an entire nation. Small daily actions, repeated over years and decades, contributed to broader social changes that would eventually transform society. As we continue exploring this world, we find that the story of the 1950s housewife is not simply about rules or traditions. It is about people adapting to the circumstances of their time, finding meaning in their responsibilities, and responding to a rapidly changing world. Their experiences remain an important reminder that history is ultimately built from the lives of ordinary people whose contributions often go unnoticed, even though they help shape the future in ways that are impossible to measure at the time. As the decade drew closer to its end, subtle signs of change were becoming harder to ignore. The younger generation had grown up in a world filled with new possibilities, and many began questioning traditions that their parents had accepted without hesitation. Newspapers, books, and public discussions slowly introduced ideas that challenged long-standing assumptions about gender, roles, and personal freedom. These conversations were still relatively small, but they marked the beginning of a cultural shift that would become much more visible in the years ahead. For many housewives, however, daily life remained largely unchanged. The alarm clock still rang early. Breakfast still needed to be prepared. Laundry baskets still filled up, and grocery lists still had to be organised. The routines that defined domestic life continued day after day. What often went unnoticed was the amount of planning required behind the scenes. Running a household successfully demanded organisation, patience, and problem-solving skills. Many women managed these responsibilities with remarkable efficiency, even though society rarely described their efforts as a form of expertise. The relationship between technology and housework also remained complicated. New appliances promised convenience, but they did not eliminate expectations. Instead, standards often increased. Cleaner homes became the norm. More elaborate meals became possible. Tasks that once seemed impressive became ordinary. As a result, the amount of recognition women received for their work did not necessarily increase, even when the expectations placed upon them continued to grow. Community life played an important role during this period as well. Churches, schools, neighbourhood groups and local organisations often depended heavily on volunteer efforts. Women organised events, raised funds, coordinated activities, and supported causes that strengthened their communities. Although these contributions were frequently unpaid, they had a lasting impact on the lives of countless families. Entire neighbourhoods benefited from the dedication of women whose names rarely appeared in newspapers or history books. Looking back, it becomes clear that the story of the 1950s housewife cannot be reduced to a simple stereotype. It was not merely a story of cheerful advertisements or restrictive expectations. It was a story of real individuals living within a particular moment in history, doing their best to meet responsibilities while navigating the opportunities and limitations of their time. Their lives reflected both the strengths and contradictions of the society around them. The more closely we examine their experiences, the more we appreciate the complexity hidden beneath the familiar image. Behind every polished photograph stood a person with ambitions, worries, talents, and dreams. And it is those human stories that continue to make this chapter of history so fascinating decades later. Perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions about the 1950s is the belief that everyone was completely satisfied with the way things were. While many people appreciated the stability and opportunities of the era, others quietly questioned whether the traditional model of family life truly suited everyone. These thoughts were often kept private. Openly challenging social expectations could attract criticism, and many individuals preferred to avoid conflict by keeping their opinions to themselves. Even so, change has a way of beginning quietly. It often starts with simple conversations between friends, family members, or co-workers. During the late 1950s, more women began discussing subjects that previous generations rarely spoke about openly. They talked about education, careers, personal goals, and the desire for greater independence. These conversations did not immediately transform society, but they planted ideas that would continue growing in the years ahead. Meanwhile, daily life continued moving forward. Children grew up, families celebrated holidays, neighbours gathered for community events, and households followed familiar routines. For most people, history was not something happening in distant government buildings or on newspaper front pages. It was happening in kitchens, living rooms, schools, and neighbourhoods. The small choices made by ordinary families would eventually contribute to much larger cultural changes. What makes the story of the 1950s housewife so valuable is that it reminds us how complex human experiences can be. The same lifestyle that brought comfort and purpose to one person might feel limiting to another. There was no single experience that defined every woman. Some embraced the role wholeheartedly. Others wished for different opportunities. Many lived somewhere in between, appreciating certain aspects of their lives while questioning others. Modern audiences sometimes view the decade through a lens of nostalgia, imagining a simpler and easier world. Yet every historical period has its own challenges. The women of the 1950s faced pressures that were unique to their time, just as people face different pressures today. Understanding those challenges helps us move beyond stereotypes and see the individuals who lived through them as real people, rather than symbols of an era. As we continue exploring this fascinating chapter of American history, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The polished image presented in magazines and advertisements was only the surface. Beneath it existed millions of personal stories filled with hard work, sacrifice, determination, and resilience. Those stories reveal a world far more interesting than the idealized picture often remembered today, and they continue to offer valuable lessons about society, culture, and the everyday lives of ordinary people. As historians continue uncovering more personal accounts from the period, they often find a gap between public appearances and private realities. Family photo albums show smiling faces gathered around dinner tables, celebrating holidays or posing proudly in front of new homes. These images capture genuine moments of happiness, but they rarely reveal the effort required to create them. Behind every photograph were countless hours of planning, cleaning, cooking, budgeting, and caregiving that made those moments possible. Many women developed extraordinary abilities without ever receiving formal recognition for them. They became skilled negotiators when balancing family needs with limited budgets. They acted as teachers while helping children learn important life lessons. They served as nurses when family members became sick and as counselors when loved ones faced difficulties. Modern job descriptions might separate these responsibilities into different professions. Yet countless housewives performed all of them within a single day. The social expectations of the era also encouraged women to place the needs of others before their own. Personal ambitions were often postponed in favour of family responsibilities. Some women accepted this willingly, while others quietly wondered what paths they might have taken under different circumstances. Their reflections remind us that every generation contains individuals whose dreams extend beyond the roles society assigns to them. At the same time, it would be unfair to describe the decade only in terms of limitations. Many women found genuine pride in building strong families and creating welcoming homes. They formed lasting friendships, supported their communities, and played a central role in shaping the environments where children grew up. Their contributions helped define daily life for millions of people across the country. What makes this history so fascinating is its complexity. The 1950s were neither a perfect golden age, nor a time of constant unhappiness. They were a period filled with both opportunities and challenges, comfort and pressure, satisfaction and frustration. Like every era in history, they contained contradictions that cannot be fully captured by simple labels or stereotypes. Perhaps the most important lesson is that ordinary people often influence history in ways that are not immediately visible. The women who managed households during the 1950s may not have expected future generations to study their lives. Yet their experiences reveal a great deal about the values, priorities, and expectations of their society. Through their stories, we gain a deeper understanding of how everyday life shaped the world that followed and how even the most routine activities can become important pieces of history when viewed through the lens of time. Over time, the memories of this generation became an important source for understanding what life was truly like behind the polished image of the 1950s, when researchers interviewed women who had lived through the decade. Many described lives that were far more demanding than younger generations expected. Some remembered spending nearly every waking hour focused on household responsibilities. Others recalled the satisfaction that came from building a stable home during a period of rapid growth and change. Their stories reveal that history is rarely black and white. Most lives contain moments of both happiness and hardship. The homes of the 1950s were often presented as symbols of success. Families worked hard to purchase houses, furnish rooms, and create comfortable environments for their children. Yet maintaining those homes required constant effort. Dust returned, dishes piled up, laundry accumulated, and meals had to be prepared day after day. Unlike many achievements that can be completed once and celebrated, housework was continuous. The tasks repeated endlessly, creating a cycle that never truly ended. Another fascinating aspect of the era was the importance placed on appearances. People often believed that a well-kept home reflected strong moral values and personal discipline. This belief increased the pressure on women to maintain high standards, even when they felt exhausted. Visitors might spend only a few minutes inside a house, but many women spent hours preparing for the possibility of their arrival. Such expectations became a normal part of everyday life. Despite these pressures, countless women demonstrated remarkable determination. They adapted to challenges, solved problems creatively, and provided support to their families during both ordinary and difficult times. Their resilience helped communities function smoothly and contributed to the stability that many people associate with the decade. As the years passed and society continued evolving, many of the old expectations gradually faded. New opportunities emerged, and future generations gained greater freedom to define success in different ways. Yet the experiences of 1950s housewives remain valuable because they offer a window into a world shaped by traditions that influenced millions of lives. Their story reminds us that history is not only made by famous leaders or dramatic events. It is also created by ordinary people performing everyday tasks, making sacrifices for their families, and adapting to the expectations of their time. The women who lived through the 1950s may not have considered themselves historical figures, but their experiences became an essential part of understanding one of the most recognizable decades in modern American history. By the beginning of the 1960s, the world that had seemed so predictable during the previous decade was already starting to change. New generations were growing up with different expectations, and many long-standing traditions were being questioned for the first time. Yet the influence of the 1950s remained strong. The image of the devoted housewife continued to appear in magazines, television programs, and advertisements, serving as a symbol of an era that many people still admired. For the women who had spent years managing households, however, life was never as simple as those images suggested. Every day required decisions, planning, and effort. Families depended on them for far more than cooking and cleaning. They organised schedules, remembered important dates, cared for relatives, solved unexpected problems, and helped maintain a sense of stability during uncertain times. Their responsibilities extended into nearly every aspect of family life. One reason these stories remain important is because they highlight how much work can go unnoticed when it becomes part of a daily routine. When meals appear on the table every evening, people rarely think about the planning behind them. When children arrive at school prepared and cared for, the effort involved often remains invisible. Yet these small acts, repeated thousands of times over many years, shape lives in profound ways. The women of the 1950s also lived during a period when society placed enormous value on conformity. Standing out was often discouraged, while fitting in was rewarded. This environment influenced everything from fashion choices to personal ambitions. Many people genuinely believed they were following the best path available, while others quietly felt constrained by expectations they had little power to change. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the unusual rules and customs of the era. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the story is not the rules themselves. It is the people who lived under them. Their lives were filled with the same hopes, fears, successes, and disappointments that people experience in every generation. They wanted security for their families, happiness for their children, and a sense of purpose in their daily lives. As history moved forward, many of the expectations that defined the 1950s gradually evolved. New opportunities appeared, social attitudes shifted, and future generations built upon the experiences of those who came before them. Yet the legacy of the women who kept households running throughout the decade remained. Their quiet efforts helped shape families, communities, and ultimately the society that followed, leaving an impact far greater than most could have imagined at the time. The further we move away from the 1950s, the more fascinating it becomes to examine how people viewed their own lives. During that period, most women were not thinking about how future historians would interpret their experiences. They were focused on practical concerns, paying bills, preparing meals, caring for children, and keeping their households functioning smoothly. History often feels dramatic when viewed from a distance, but for those living through it, daily life usually consisted of small responsibilities repeated over and over again. These ordinary routines helped create the foundation of family life. Children returned home from school to meals that had been prepared in advance. Clothes were washed, repaired, and organised. Holiday celebrations were planned with care. Birthdays, family gatherings, and community events did not happen automatically. They required effort from people working quietly behind the scenes. In countless homes across America, women carried much of that responsibility. At the same time, the decade was filled with optimism about the future. New technologies continued entering households. Modern appliances promised convenience, and many families believed that each year would bring greater comfort than the one before. For some people, these changes represented exciting opportunities. For others, they simply created new expectations and new standards that had to be maintained. One of the reasons the story of the 1950s housewife remains relevant today is because it encourages us to think about the relationship between society and individual choice. Every generation inherits a set of expectations about how people should live. Some of those expectations are embraced, while others are challenged. The women of the 1950s navigated these pressures in different ways, creating lives that reflected both personal decisions and cultural influences. Their experiences also remind us that progress is often gradual. Major social changes rarely appear overnight. They begin with conversations, questions, and small shifts in attitude that slowly spread through communities. The changes that would transform society in later decades were already beginning to take shape, even if many people could not yet see where those changes would lead. Looking back now, the image of the perfect 1950s housewife tells only part of the story. Beyond the advertisements and television programs were real. Individuals with unique personalities, ambitions, and challenges. Their lives reveal a far more detailed and human picture of the era. And as we continue exploring this remarkable period, we discover that the true history of the 1950s is not found only in famous events, but also in the everyday experiences of millions of ordinary people whose efforts quietly shaped the world around them. As researchers continue studying the decade, they often emphasize that the 1950s were a period shaped by both continuity and change. Many traditions remained strong, yet new ideas were slowly emerging beneath the surface. Families followed routines that had existed for generations, but the world around them was evolving at a rapid pace. Economic growth, technological advances, and shifting social attitudes were beginning to influence how people thought about their futures. For many women, this created an interesting balance between expectation and possibility. Society still promoted a traditional vision of family life, yet opportunities that had once seemed unreachable were becoming more visible. Some women pursued education, developed new interests, or imagined careers beyond the home. Others remained devoted to domestic life and found meaning within the responsibilities they carried each day. The reality was far more varied than the simple images often presented. In popular culture, the importance of community should not be overlooked either. Neighborhoods during the 1950s often functioned as close social networks. Families knew one another, children played together, and local events brought people together regularly. Women frequently played a central role in maintaining these connections. They organized gatherings, supported neighbors during difficult times, and helped create the sense of belonging that many people later remembered so fondly. Yet, even within these supportive communities, expectations could feel overwhelming. The desire to meet social standards influenced everything from household cleanliness to parenting decisions. People naturally compared themselves to those around them, and many worried about whether they were living up to the ideal image promoted by society. These pressures were not unique to the 1950s, but they were particularly visible during a decade that placed such a strong emphasis on appearances and respectability. Looking back today, it becomes clear that the women of the era were doing far more than maintaining homes. They were managing complex systems of relationships, responsibilities, and expectations. Their work extended far beyond what was visible on the surface. Every organised household represented countless decisions and countless hours of effort that rarely appeared in public discussions. This is why the story of the 1950s housewife remains such an important part of social history. It helps us understand not only how people lived, but also how cultural values influenced everyday choices. Through these stories, we gain insight into the hopes, pressures, and realities that shaped one of the most recognisable decades of the 20th century. And with each personal account that survives, the picture becomes richer, revealing a world far more complicated than the polished advertisements ever suggested. Perhaps what makes this period so interesting is that many of the expectations placed upon women were considered completely reasonable at the time. People rarely questioned them because they had grown up surrounded by the same ideas. Parents taught them to their children, schools reinforced them, and popular media repeated them constantly. As a result, millions of women accepted responsibilities that today might seem unusually demanding. This demonstrates how strongly culture can influence what people consider normal. The household itself was often viewed as a reflection of the family. A clean living room suggested discipline. Well-behaved children suggested good parenting. A carefully prepared dinner suggested dedication and responsibility. Because of this, many women felt pressure to maintain high standards even when they were tired or overwhelmed. Success was often measured by how smoothly the family appeared to function rather than by personal accomplishments. Despite these expectations, women continually found ways to shape the world around them. Through volunteer work, community involvement, and family leadership, they influenced countless aspects of everyday life. Schools benefited from their support. Neighbourhood organisations depended on their participation. Charitable events often relied upon their efforts, although these contributions were not always recognised publicly. They played a significant role in strengthening communities across the country. As the decade progressed, younger generations began seeing the world through a slightly different lens. Greater access to education exposed people to new perspectives. Economic changes created new opportunities. Advances in communication allowed ideas to spread more rapidly than before. Little by little, conversations about personal freedom, equality, and opportunity became more common. These discussions would eventually reshape many of the assumptions that had defined the previous era. Yet it is important not to judge the past too quickly. The people of the 1950s lived according to the values and circumstances of their own time. Many genuinely believed they were building the best possible future for their families. Their choices were influenced by experiences, traditions, and expectations that may seem distant today, but made sense within the context of their world. The story of the 1950s housewife, therefore, reveals more than household, routines, or social customs. It reveals how societies create ideals, how individuals respond to those ideals, and how cultural expectations evolve over time. Through the experiences of ordinary women, we gain a deeper understanding of an entire era. Their lives remind us that history is often found not only in major events, but also in the quiet routines of everyday life, where countless small actions combine to shape the future in ways that few people can foresee. As we look deeper into the final years of the decade, it becomes clear that the world many people considered permanent was already beginning to shift beneath their feet. The routines remained familiar, the expectations remained strong, and the image of the perfect family continued to dominate popular culture. Yet change was quietly approaching. New generations were growing up with different experiences and different ideas about what the future could look like. For many women, the contrast between public image and private reality became increasingly noticeable. Society celebrated the appearance of perfection, but real life rarely followed a perfect script. Children became sick, budgets became tight, appliances broke, and unexpected problems appeared without warning. The ability to adapt to these challenges required patience, creativity, and resilience. These qualities were rarely highlighted in advertisements, yet they were among the most important skills women used every day. The longer historians study this period, the more they recognize the remarkable amount of responsibility carried by ordinary housewives. They were planners, organizers, caretakers, teachers, and problem solvers all at once. Their work touched nearly every aspect of family life. Although much of it happened behind closed doors, its impact could be seen in the stability and success of the households they helped maintain. At the same time, many women were beginning to imagine possibilities that extended beyond traditional expectations. Some wanted additional education. Others dreamed of careers, travel, or personal projects that would allow them to explore different parts of their identities. These ambitions did not necessarily mean rejecting family life. Instead, they reflected a growing desire for greater choice and greater control over personal futures. This gradual shift in thinking would become one of the most important developments of the coming decades. The questions being asked in quiet conversations during the late 1950s would eventually influence larger discussions throughout society. What opportunities should be available to women? How should responsibilities be shared within families? What does personal fulfillment really mean? These questions would shape cultural debates for years to come. Yet before those changes fully arrived, millions of women continued living within the familiar rhythms of the decade. They woke up each morning, cared for their families, managed their homes, and did their best to meet the expectations placed upon them. Their stories remain valuable because they show us what everyday life actually looked like beneath the polished surface of history. And the closer we examine those stories, the more we understand that the true history of the 1950s was written not only by famous figures, but by ordinary people whose daily efforts quietly shaped the world around them. One of the most overlooked aspects of the 1950s housewife's life was how much of her success depended on skills that were difficult to measure. There were no performance reviews, promotions, or public awards for maintaining a happy household. Yet every day required careful decisions. A family budget had to be stretched as far as possible. Meals needed to be planned around available ingredients. Children's needs had to be balanced against household expenses. Small mistakes could create problems that affected the entire family. Many women became experts at managing limited resources. They saved leftovers, repaired clothing instead of replacing it, and found creative ways to make family income go further. During a time when consumer culture encouraged constant purchasing, these practical skills remained essential in many homes. Their ability to manage resources often played a major role in determining a family's financial stability. The expectations surrounding motherhood were equally demanding. Mothers were expected not only to care for children physically, but also to shape their character. Good manners, respect for authority, and proper behaviour were considered important reflections of family values. If children succeeded, parents received praise. If children struggled, mothers were often blamed. This placed tremendous pressure on women to constantly supervise and guide their families. At the same time, society rarely acknowledged how exhausting these responsibilities could become. A woman might spend an entire day solving problems, caring for others, and completing chores without receiving much recognition. Because these duties were viewed as normal, many people simply expected them to be done. The effort behind them often remained invisible. Yet despite these challenges, many women developed incredible resilience. They learned to adapt when circumstances changed, to remain calm during difficult situations, and to continue supporting their families through both good times and bad. These qualities helped countless households navigate uncertainty and contributed to the sense of stability that many people later associated with the decade. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the story of the 1950s housewife is also a story about endurance. It is about people carrying responsibilities that others depended upon every single day. It is about finding ways to keep moving forward even when the work seemed endless. And it is about the countless women whose efforts helped shape the lives of their children, strengthen their communities, and influence future generations in ways that were rarely recognised at the time. Their contributions may not always have appeared in headlines, but they became an essential part of the history of modern America. As the story of the 1950s housewife unfolds, we begin to see that her world was built upon a delicate balance between duty and expectation. Society celebrated the results of her work, but rarely focused on the effort required to achieve them. A tidy home, a successful family, and well-mannered children were often viewed as natural outcomes rather than accomplishments that demanded patience and dedication. This made much of her labour practically invisible, even though it affected every member of the household. The pace of daily life could be relentless. Before many families owned the conveniences that later generations would take for granted. Simple tasks often required considerable time and energy. Shopping involved multiple trips to local stores. Meals were prepared from scratch. Clothing frequently needed mending. Household organisation depended more on personal effort than on technology. Each completed task was quickly replaced by another waiting to be done. Social expectations also influenced how women viewed their own achievements. Rather than focusing on personal recognition, many were encouraged to measure success through the well-being of others. A healthy family a welcoming home, and a respected reputation within the community became important sources of pride. While these accomplishments were meaningful, they sometimes left little room for individual ambitions that existed beyond domestic life. Yet within these limitations, many women found ways to express creativity and independence. Some became skilled decorators, talented cooks, active volunteers, or respected community organisers. Others pursued hobbies, reading, writing, or artistic interests whenever time allowed. Their lives were often far richer and more varied than the simplified image presented in magazines and television programmes. The longer historians examine this era, the more they discover how much strength was required to navigate its expectations. Maintaining a household was not simply a routine. It was a continuous process of planning, adapting, and solving problems. Unexpected expenses, family emergencies, and everyday challenges demanded flexibility and determination. Women who managed these responsibilities successfully demonstrated abilities that were valuable far beyond the walls of their homes. Perhaps this is why the history of the 1950s housewife remains so compelling. It is not merely a story about cleaning, cooking, or social customs. It is a story about people striving to build meaningful lives within the framework of their time. Their experiences reveal both the opportunities and limitations of the world they inhabited, and as we continue exploring their lives, we gain a deeper appreciation for the ordinary, individuals whose quiet efforts helped shape an entire generation and left a lasting mark on the history of modern America. Another important part of understanding the 1950s is recognizing how much of family life depended upon routines. Routine provided structure, predictability, and a sense of order. Every member of the household usually had a role to play, but much of the responsibility for coordinating daily life rested with the woman of the house. She often knew which bills were due, what groceries were needed, which appointments were scheduled, and what tasks had to be completed before the end of the week. This constant mental organisation required attention that few people fully appreciated. Unlike many jobs that end when a workday is over, the responsibilities of a housewife rarely stopped completely. Even after dinner was served and dishes were cleaned, there were plans to make for the following day. School activities, household repairs, shopping lists, and family concerns often occupied her thoughts long after the visible work was finished. In many ways, managing a home involved both physical labour and continuous planning. The expectations of the era also created a strong connection between personal identity and family reputation. People were often judged not only as individuals but also as representatives of their households. Because of this, women frequently felt responsible for maintaining standards that reflected positively on the entire family, whether hosting guests, attending community events, or interacting with neighbours. They were expected to present an image of confidence and competence. Despite the pressure, many women formed strong support networks. Friends shared advice, exchanged recipes, helped one another during difficult times, and created communities built upon cooperation. These relationships provided encouragement and companionship in a world where many responsibilities were carried privately. Through these connections, women found ways to navigate challenges and celebrate successes together. Looking at the decade today, it is easy to focus on what has changed. Yet it is equally important to notice what has remained the same. People still care deeply about family, stability, and creating comfortable homes. They still hope to provide opportunities for their children and support those they love, while the roles and expectations surrounding these goals have evolved. The underlying desires remain remarkably familiar. This is what makes the story of the 1950s housewife so enduring. It is not simply a story about one decade. It is a story about responsibility, adaptation, and the ways ordinary people respond to the expectations of their time. Through their efforts, challenges, and achievements, these women left behind a legacy that extends far beyond the kitchens and living rooms where much of their work took place, offering future generations valuable insight into the realities of everyday life in a rapidly changing world. As the decade moved toward its conclusion, many of the values associated with the 1950 Sekunde remained deeply rooted in everyday life. Families continued gathering around dinner tables. Neighbours still knew one another by name. And communities often revolved around schools, churches, and local organisations. For many people, these connections created a sense of belonging that became one of the most cherished memories of the era. Yet beneath this stability, the seeds of future change were already beginning to grow. The experiences of housewives during this period demonstrate how much society depends upon work that often goes unnoticed. A household does not organise itself. Children do not raise themselves. Family traditions do not appear automatically. Behind each of these things stood individuals investing time, energy, and care into the lives of others. Their efforts created environments where families could thrive, even if the work itself was rarely celebrated. Many women also became the keepers of family history. They preserved photographs, remembered birthdays, organised holiday gatherings, and passed stories from one generation to the next. These responsibilities may seem small, but they helped create the sense of identity that connected families over time. Without realising it, countless women became guardians of memories that future generations would treasure. At the same time, the changing world was introducing new possibilities. Young people were beginning to imagine futures that looked different from those of their parents. Educational opportunities expanded, cultural attitudes evolved, and new ideas spread more rapidly than ever before. The traditional expectations that had defined much of the decade would soon face increasing challenges from a society becoming more diverse and more open to different paths in life. Yet, regardless of how much the world changed, the contributions of the women who lived through the 1950s remained significant. They helped shape communities, support families, and create the daily routines that formed the foundation of ordinary life. Their stories remind us that history is not only driven by major events, but also by the consistent efforts of people whose names may never appear in textbooks. When we look beyond the advertisements and television programs that defined the public image of the decade, we discover something far more meaningful. We find individuals navigating responsibilities, balancing expectations, and doing their best within the circumstances of their time. Their lives were filled with challenges, accomplishments, hopes, and sacrifices that deserve to be remembered. And through understanding their experiences, we gain a richer understanding of an era that continues to fascinate people many decades later. The lasting influence of the 1950s can still be seen in the way people remember the decade today. For some, it represents a time of stability, close-knit communities, and strong family traditions. For others, it serves as a reminder of how restrictive social expectations could become when people were expected to fit into very specific roles. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, which is why the era continues to inspire discussion among historians and the public alike, as memories of the decade were passed down through generations. Many stories focused on the visible parts of life: the family dinners, neighbourhood gatherings, holiday celebrations, and carefully maintained homes. Yet behind those memories existed countless acts of dedication that often went unnoticed. Someone had to prepare the meals, organise the events, remember the important dates, and keep daily life moving forward. In many households, that responsibility fell primarily to women. The more historians study these lives, the more they recognise the importance of everyday experiences. Large social changes do not happen in isolation. They begin within families, communities, and ordinary conversations. The women of the 1950s played a significant role in this process, even when they were not aware of it. Through their choices, challenges, and aspirations, they helped shape the environment in which future generations would grow up. Many of the daughters raised during this period would later enter a world very different from the one their mothers had known. They would encounter new educational opportunities, expanded career options, and changing attitudes about personal freedom. Yet their experiences were built upon foundations established by previous generations. In this way, the lives of 1950s housewives became part of a larger story about social change and continuity. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from this history is the reminder that ordinary lives matter. The people who cook meals, care for children, support families, and contribute to their communities may never become famous, but their efforts shape society in powerful ways. History is not only written by leaders and innovators, it is also written by millions of individuals, carrying out responsibilities that allow everyday life to function. And so, when we look beyond the polished advertisements and idealized images of the 1950s, we discover a far richer story. We find determination, sacrifice, resilience, and humanity. We find people doing their best within the expectations of their era while quietly helping to build the future. Their experiences remain an important reminder that the most meaningful parts of history are often found not in extraordinary events, but in the ordinary lives of people whose contributions continue to echo long after their own time has passed. As historians continue reflecting on the legacy of the 1950s, they often point out that the decade cannot be understood through nostalgia alone. The smiling advertisements and cheerful television. Families told only part of the story. Real life was far more complicated. Behind every polished image stood people working hard to meet expectations, overcome challenges, and create stability in a rapidly changing world. The women who managed households during this era occupied a unique position at the centre of that effort. Many of them never expected their daily routines to become subjects of historical interest. They were simply focused on the tasks in front of them. A child needed help with schoolwork. A family member needed support. A meal needed preparation. A bill needed payment. These responsibilities may have seemed ordinary at the time, yet together they formed the foundation of everyday life for millions of families across the nation. The passage of time has also revealed how much strength was required to navigate the social expectations of the era, maintaining appearances, caring for loved ones, managing household responsibilities, and meeting community standards demanded constant attention. While these efforts often lacked public recognition, they represented an enormous contribution to society. Communities functioned more smoothly because of the work taking place inside countless homes. At the same time, the experiences of these women remind us that no generation is defined by a single story. Some embraced traditional roles and found deep fulfillment within them. Others dreamed of different opportunities and hoped for greater independence. Most lived somewhere between those extremes, balancing personal ambitions with family responsibilities. Their lives were as varied and complex as those of any generation before or after them. This complexity is what makes the history of the 1950s so fascinating. It challenges simple assumptions and encourages us to look beyond stereotypes, rather than seeing the decade as either ideal or restrictive. We begin to understand it as a period shaped by both opportunity and limitation, comfort and pressure, tradition and change. The women at the heart of this story were not merely symbols of an era. They were individuals with their own hopes, fears, talents, and aspirations. They laughed, worried, struggled, succeeded, and adapted just as people do today. Through their experiences, we gain insight into a world that may appear distant but remains deeply connected to the present. And the more closely we examine their lives, the more clearly we see that history is ultimately a story about people ordinary, people whose everyday choices quietly influence the future in ways they may never fully realise. Looking back from the modern world, it can be difficult to imagine just how powerful social expectations were during the 1950s. Today, people are encouraged to pursue a wide variety of lifestyles and personal goals. In contrast, many individuals during that era felt pressure to follow a much narrower definition of success. For women especially, that definition was often centred around marriage, motherhood, and maintaining a well-ordered home. While many embraced these responsibilities, others quietly wondered whether life might offer additional possibilities. beyond the boundaries society had established. Yet, even within these expectations, women demonstrated remarkable adaptability. When families faced financial difficulties, they found creative ways to stretch limited resources. When children encountered challenges, they provided guidance and support. When communities needed volunteers, they often stepped forward without expecting recognition. Their ability to solve problems and care for others became one of the hidden strengths of the decade. As years passed, many people who had lived through the era began sharing their memories. Some recalled neighbourhood gatherings where everyone seemed to know one another. Others remembered the pressure to maintain appearances or the exhaustion that accompanied endless household responsibilities. These personal accounts revealed a reality that was far richer and more complicated than the simplified image often portrayed in popular culture. Historians now understand that the story of the 1950s housewife is not merely about domestic life. It is also about social expectations, cultural values, and the ways individuals navigate the world around them. The choices people make are rarely formed in isolation. They are influenced by family traditions, community standards, economic conditions, and the beliefs of the era in which they live. The women of the 1950s experienced all of these influences every day. Their lives also remind us that meaningful contributions are not always visible. Many of the tasks that kept families functioning happened quietly behind closed doors. Meals were prepared, clothes were repaired, schedules were organised, and children were cared for without public attention. Yet these efforts had lasting effects that extended far beyond individual households. They helped shape communities and influenced future generations in countless ways. The deeper we explore this period, the clearer it becomes that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Beneath the familiar images of smiling families and spotless homes existed a complex world filled with responsibility, sacrifice, determination, and change. And it is through the experiences of ordinary women carrying out ordinary tasks that we gain one of the most revealing windows into what life was truly like during one of the most iconic decades in American history. By the end of the 1950s, many of the foundations of American society still appeared strong and unchanged. Families gathered for holidays, children attended local schools, and neighbourhoods continued to function according to familiar traditions. To an outside observer, it might have seemed that the decade's way of life would continue forever. Yet history often changes quietly before anyone fully notices. Beneath the surface, new ideas were spreading, and younger generations were beginning to imagine a future that looked different from the past. For many women, these changes brought both excitement and uncertainty. The traditional role of the housewife remained widely respected, but alternative paths were becoming more visible. More women were considering higher education, professional careers, and opportunities that previous generations had rarely discussed. The conversation was still in its early stages, but it represented a significant shift in how people thought about personal choice and individual potential. At the same time, the contributions of housewives remained essential to daily life. Families depended on them, not only for practical support, but also for emotional stability. They comforted children after difficult days, encouraged family members during challenging times, and helped create a sense of security within the home. These responsibilities required patience, empathy, and resilience, qualities that often received less attention than the visible tasks of cooking or cleaning. The more historians study the decade, the more they appreciate the complexity of these experiences. It is impossible to summarize millions of lives with a single description. Some women viewed their role as a source of pride and fulfillment. Others felt constrained by expectations that limited their opportunities. Many experienced both feelings at different moments in their lives. Human experiences are rarely simple, and the women of the 1950s were no exception. What remains most striking is how much influence ordinary people can have without rising IT through their daily efforts. Housewives helped shape family values, community traditions, and social expectations that lasted for generations. Their impact extended far beyond the walls of their homes. Even when their work went unnoticed, it contributed to the stability and development of the society around them. As we continue exploring this fascinating chapter of history, we are reminded that the past is made up of countless individual stories. Each home contained its own challenges, successes, hopes, and disappointments. Together, those stories created the reality of the 1950s, and by listening carefully to the experiences of the people who lived through that era, we gain a deeper understanding of a world that was far more complex, human, and interesting than the perfect images preserved in old advertisements and television programs. And so, as our journey through the world of the 1950s, Housewife slowly comes to an end, we are left with a picture far more detailed than the one found in old advertisements and television shows. What first appeared to be a simple story about tidy homes and family life reveals itself as something much deeper. It is a story about responsibility, perseverance, and the countless unseen efforts that helped shape an entire generation. The women of the 1950s lived in a world filled with expectations. They were asked to create comfortable homes, support their families, raise children, and maintain standards that often seemed impossible to achieve. Some found happiness within these roles, while others dreamed of opportunities beyond them. Yet, regardless of their individual experiences, they all played a significant part in the daily life of their communities and families. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on what was different. The clothing, the customs, the social rules, and the expectations may seem distant from modern life. But beneath those differences, the people of the 1950s shared many of the same hopes that people have today. They wanted security for their loved ones, meaningful lives, and a better future for their children. Those desires remain timeless. History often remembers great leaders, major events, and dramatic turning points. Yet the story of the 1950s housewife reminds us that history is also created in ordinary places. It is made in kitchens where meals are prepared, in living rooms where families gather, and in quiet moments when people make sacrifices for those they love. These everyday actions may seem small, but together they shape generations. As the decades passed, society changed, opportunities expanded, and many of the expectations that defined the 1950s gradually faded. but the legacy of the women who lived through that era remained. Their hard work, resilience, and dedication helped build the foundations upon which future generations would stand. Through their stories, we gain a deeper understanding, not only of the past, but also of the enduring strength of ordinary people. And now, as the lights dim on this chapter of history and the sounds of the modern world begin to fade into the distance, we leave behind the spotless kitchens, the quiet suburban streets, and the carefully arranged living rooms of 1950s America. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden realities of one of the most iconic decades in history. Until next time, rest well, sleep peacefully, and let the echoes of the past gently carry you into a calm and restful night.